watch this or pass it along to people if you do miss something or need to go back as a record later as well too. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in and get started.
Great, thank you, Brad. So this is Rachel Beld with the City of Del Mar. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm just going to cover a couple of quick things before I hand off the presentation to Brad. But basically, what we're here to talk about today is the Downtown Streetscape Plan. And we have, it's a council priority project, and we are going to begin construction in January of 2018. So what we're here today is to find out feedback from all of you of what types of projects and what types of amenities you'd like to see included in the project. We have some things that we have to do. You'll see on this slide in front of you some things that we have to do that basically address safety and accessibility issues. And Brad's going to talk about that a little bit more in the presentation. What we really want to know is what things from this nice to do bucket would you like to see included in the project beginning in January? And then also we'd like to get some feedback from folks about what types of vision and what types of long-term things should we be looking at to get us to an envision, things that maybe we can't do right away in January, but things that might need code changes or policy implementation that we can work towards as we're putting together this plan. I do want to mention that this project does extend from 9th Street to 15th Street. We are proposing to maintain the current width of two travel lanes in each direction, and we are not proposing any roundabouts. And also, we are not proposing any sharrows, and that's based on feedback that we've received so far. So with that, I think I'm going to hand this over to Brad, and he'll walk you through the presentation. You should have received an email from me with a handout, a PDF handout that you can fill out. It follows along with the presentation. You can look at that now or later with a series of questions and space for comments. If you could please send that back to me by the end of the day tomorrow, I would really appreciate it. And with that, I'll hand it off to Brad.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, to jump in, I'll let you know kind of when we get to the handout portion that Rachel was just mentioning on when we'll actually start the slides that'll have the specific questions and syllable pieces. But we just wanted to give a broad overview of the project and give you some of the background before we dive into some of the specifics. As we were beginning to work on this project, we were identifying the sort of overall larger project goals and what are we really trying to achieve with the streetscape. The first being improving walkability and the pedestrian experience. You know, having a better pedestrian flow and making it a better place for pedestrians to be along the downtown Camino Del Mar, along Camino Del Mar. Also looking to improve the outdoor business and shopping and dining experience, having the ability to attract new people driving through that see something interesting, or potentially trying to get people to linger or see other things in Del Mar and explore a little bit more, and help the retail and businesses along the corridor thrive. And also really part of that is making sure that we're not being too interruptive as we're doing, you know, construction or other works in that, knowing that we've got a target window that we're trying to keep construction focused from January to May, so we're not impacting the busy summer months or the holiday season, and knowing that this may require a couple phases, the sort of short-term phase and the long-term phase. The third is also enhancing community character and really sort of bringing out the assets and highlighting what makes Del Mar unique and very interesting to be in, and sort of keeping anything that we do with the streetscape sort of uniquely Del Mar, that it doesn't look like every other place, you know, that with ocean frontage, that it's different from Encinitas, it's different from, you know, Carlsbad. And then the fourth one is the improvements for pedestrian and bicycle safety. A lot of the sort of have-to-do items that we just know that are out there for ADA safety and, you know, adding bike lanes and pieces like that. Rachel had also briefly touched on the items that we're not looking at as a part of this, including roundabouts, bicycle sharrows. For those of you not familiar with the bicycle sharrow, it's basically when a bicycle shares a lane with an automobile travel lane, and we're not proposing that. We will keep a dedicated bike lane, and that's what currently exists from 13th to 15th. We're not looking at reducing travel lanes. We'll keep 2 lanes in both directions throughout the corridor. And we're not looking at wholesale parking removal throughout the corridor. The parking really will remain pretty close to the same quantities intact. We may lose a space here due to ADA issues, but we may also gain some spaces, so it should be pretty much a net balance at the end of the day for parking. Rachel had also mentioned the scope of the work really is from 9th to 15th Street, and the bulk of this is really going to be from 9th to 13th. The 13th to 15th actually has had some recent updates to ADA bulb outs, new paving in some areas, and some other small-scale pieces such as site furnishings have been installed already, but we're still looking at opportunities to improve paving where there's problems, looking at lighting, looking at updating the planting, and looking at adding any other site furnishings or art or other enhancements. But really knowing that 9th and 13th is an area that has a lot of different conditions, and we're really trying to keep most of our focus on that area, but we want to make sure that we look at the whole downtown corridor as a whole. As a part of the 13th to 15th Street improvements that were made, the sidewalk paving material, tree grates, a lot of the site furnishings, some of the planting styles, the outdoor cafe seating, and these crosswalk improvements and mid-block crossings have really kind of already been decided. So those are things that we want to just make sure that people are still comfortable with moving forward on, seeing if that's still appropriate or if we think we should start looking at going a different direction. We were also the landscape architects that were involved in the City Hall and Civic Center project, and throughout that process, we have frontage on Camino Del Mar as well too, but we also kind of revalidated some of the paving types, the planting character, some of the lighting and furnishings. So a lot of this outwork, outreach has been done for some of these materials, but we just want to make sure that we're sort of confirming that what we'd heard over the last year or two is still sort of valid today. One other thing that we wanted to talk a little bit about in terms of making or enhancing the unique character of Del Mar, and this was something that was coming up as we were working on this project approximately about a year ago, and are now starting to bring it back, was the idea that not having a homogeneous landscape, the idea that you might want to look at creating distinct zones along Camino Del Mar that might each have a little bit different character. For example, the Gateway Gardens might be a little bit more focused on unique planting or interesting planting, as opposed to like the City Hall Plaza, which is going to be much more hardscape based for large scale gatherings, and the Civic Center pieces that actually will be going in support of the city. Civic Center Plaza area, and then the garden districts. So we have areas that might have different feels, but it'll still feel like a unified streetscape project. But just making sure that we're keeping uniqueness of Del Mar. Rachel also mentioned the have-to-do items, and these are items that we're really doing sort of no matter what. They're not really the beautification items, but we know that a lot of them are problem items or items that we've heard people say that they want to have happen, and we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail as we move forward on the slides. And then there's the large list of these streetscape beautification items, and these are the sort of nice-to-do items. We'd like to get your feedback on this to include as many of these items into this first phase as possible. And on that, we have a slide for each one of these as well too, so I'm not going to read all of these right now or try to read through these. It just take a little bit too much time. Some of these have-to-do improvements, really you're seeing kind of the red circles on this slide show a lot of the hotspot items for ADA issues, and then the yellow just show that we're really looking at improved planting, stormwater improvements, irrigation, and repaving and lighting throughout the entire corridor. And this page actually is where your handout with the questionnaire begins that Rachel had mentioned earlier. And we've also color coded these slides. This slide you'll see has a green background. Hopefully everybody's able to see that. And the green background means that this is something that is a have to do, and we're doing it in the very short term. Later you'll see some slides that will have yellow backgrounds. Those are things that we would like to try to do in the first phase, as long as there's consensus that that's a good idea. And then you'll see some other slides that'll have gray backgrounds. And those are items that we think are probably longer term items, just for the fact that it may require some sort of code change or policy change, or it may require a lot more coordination with the actual individual property or business owner. And we don't want to try to rush through any of that. We want to make sure that that's all well coordinated and done. So the first one here that you're seeing is sort of sidewalk connectivity improvements. And the photo, I'm hoping everybody can see my mouse up here now, that is a typical intersection on this sort of south end of the area. This is 11th Street, that there really are not safe pedestrian crosswalks. The slopes are really too steep in some of these areas. And then the photo below is at 12th Street, and thinking that we would like to add new pedestrian bulb outs to actually make safe crossings and to get the cross slopes off of here for these other areas that we had highlighted in red, basically just for pedestrian safety. Stormwater improvements throughout the corridor is something else that we'll be doing on the have-to-do list. And as we're looking at the stormwater improvements, one thing that we're looking at are the idea of these flow-through planters. And these areas will actually slowly capture and then hold and slowly release stormwater, but they'll also be treating it to get rid of some of the pollutants that are in there as well too. The nice thing about the flow-through planters, in addition to the ecological benefits, is that they actually provide an opportunity to provide some streetscape planting and some softening of the streetscape, and will allow us to do some nice planting along the area as well too. We'll be looking at replacing any sort of old infrastructure, bad drains, and the things that we see, knowing that stormwater really is a problem throughout the corridor, and there is a lot of water that really rushes through here during busy rainfall events. Another item that we're looking at as a part of phase one, you'll see this has a yellow background, is we're thinking that we would like to do this in phase one, but trying to make sure that we're looking at what types of planting people might want. You can see some of the existing planting that's up here in the upper left corner that's kind of the large screening evergreen shrubs, and thinking that they're a little dated and kind of not necessarily appropriate for the streetscape, and thinking that we would want to go to something that's a lot more drought tolerant. And you can see some of the photos below that show some of the more recent planting that include the succulents, the aloes, the agaves, but also still wanting to look at sort of the median style planting in the upper right that might include a lot more of the flowering shrubs or the other natives. So thinking that, we would like some feedback on what type of planting. Do you think that the drought tolerant planting is appropriate? And then as a part of that, we'll also be looking at completely upgrading the irrigation system as a part of this to use higher efficiency irrigation, including potential purple pipe for reclaimed water should it become available in the future, so that you don't have to rip all this out and restart. Other things that we're looking at are areas where you might incorporate planters and pots, and areas that are a little bit more human scale and human nature, and thinking about if there's wider areas, could we do pots or plants that kind of become, seating or bench areas, or that start to define outdoor cafe zones, or that are more artistic and kind of, that look like a piece of art. And then also looking at flowering baskets that could be potentially placed onto light poles. Street trees are another kind of important decision that we're looking for feedback on. There's a lot of large existing trees that are out there, including the eucalyptus trees that you see in the upper right. This is in front of the library building. And thinking that some of these trees have really reached the end of their useful life, and branches are starting to fall and could be a potential hazard, and thinking that it might be appropriate to try to replace these trees. Knowing that visibility for retail signage and frontage is also really important. We want to make sure we find the right balance of trees that help sequester carbon and actually create a nice pedestrian experience to provide shade, but knowing that we don't want to necessarily block views. So we'll be looking at where locations are appropriate. We've got a series of questions of how do you feel about the existing trees that are out there? Are some of them too big? Should we be replacing them? Just gathering general feedback on that. The next item we'd like to talk a little bit about is sort of pedestrian lighting. And one thing we've heard that's come up is that the existing lights that you can see in the upper left, I'm going to circle this with my mouse, are kind of the large 35-foot tall pole lights, and much more appropriate for when Camino del Mar was actually more of a thoroughfare and a highway under state control. And thinking we'd like to have more pedestrian scale, lower level lighting. And there's a couple of options or questions on the lighting type. Do we want to look at more pedestrian pole lighting, or do we want to look at more bollard lighting, which would be roughly 42 inches in height? I'm just kind of jumping slides so you can see both. Is there a preference toward an 8 to 12-foot pole light, or more of a 42-inch high bollard light? And then the other kind of decision making on this is, what's the style, or what kind of look do we want to actually do for the pedestrian lighting? Do we want to do something a little bit more modern, such as the slide we're showing here, or something a little bit more craftsman style, as we're showing here, or even something that's kind of a mix of modern and craftsman with a little historic flair? Or something that had actually been coming out was maybe we would actually retain some of the existing historic lights, or look at repurposing some of the historic lights, or finding this historic light look and upgrading the fixtures to LED bulbs at the top. Any lighting that we would be looking at would be lower levels of lighting. We'd be using energy efficient fixtures with LEDs, and they would also have smart timing sensors so that they would be able to dim, and you wouldn't have to have a lot of light on the nighttime hours. We wouldn't want these shining into people's windows or anything like that if it would become a nuisance. They'd all be dark sky compliant, meaning that they would all be shining down as opposed to having light shining up. And this would also provide an opportunity for us to include flower baskets and potential banner signage onto all these items as well too. And another kind of potential thing that we're throwing out there is that the light poles could actually be Wi-Fi equipped, so there could be a public Wi-Fi system throughout sort of Camino del Mar to help get people to sort of linger or stay, or potentially generate more pedestrian traffic as people are able to use Wi-Fi that can be integrated into these poles. And then similar for the bollard lighting, these are just the lower level lights, not as much light output, but thinking that this might be an accent light that you might use at intersections, or you might use these in between the pedestrian poles, but just something to try to provide some more pedestrian scale, again, using lower levels of light, LEDs, and still meeting the dark sky protection. And something else we'd like a little bit of feedback on is what people's thought are on some of the other accent lighting that kind of help define these retail corridors, or special lighting like the twinkle lights, which are the photos on the left that are like the LED rep lights. and thinking, are these appropriate year-round? Would you like to see these, planted maybe during holiday periods or special event periods, that become kind of the nice lingering moment that people invite people to explore. Also looking at, would people be interested in catenary string lights or allowing a program that does that? And it's a little hard to see, but for those of you that aren't familiar, usually these are the lights that are strung on some sort of wire or string. And then there's little lights that kind of float or hover on this string that provide a little bit of downlight. You see a lot of these in outdoor cafes or restaurants. And even looking at sort of tree downlighting that might be able to help accent or highlight some of the street trees along here for special areas. Jumping to the nice to do improvements, these are the ones that we really would like to try to include as many of these in the sort of phase 1 as possible, depending on how much of a consensus we can gather on these. And some of these more creative and fun things that we're really looking at are, instead of just having standard crosswalks, could we actually incorporate art or do something which is a little bit more decorative, such as a fish or the Del Mar logo, or footprints, or other sort of art that we can incorporate. We talked a little bit about the hanging flower pots, and then also talked a little bit about banners. There's also the idea that if we get wider sidewalks or have areas at intersections, you might be able to do some more creative sort of gathering spaces that aren't just benches, but areas that create sort of outdoor rooms and allow people to kind of mingle and gather and hang out, or have sort of an impromptu meeting. Other options that we're looking at are really exploring utility box murals, or even wrapping them with art, or even looking at artistic or decorative paving that might include mosaic or tile or other pieces. And the city has a new art policy that was just approved by council a couple months ago, and we're not necessarily saying that we would actually propose the art as a part of this, but any art that comes out of this would have to meet that art council or art policy that's been approved already. But stuff that we're trying to get feedback on is that interesting to you? And if so, we'll look for how to move that forward. The site furnishings, this is where we're talking a little bit about the types of paving and the benches and trash cans and things that have been included from the 13th to 15th Street area. The primary paving that you'll see here is the exposed aggregate concrete, which is the kind of rocky looking concrete. That was primarily used from the new 13th to 15th Street, and we're using it at City Hall, and we're just wanting feedback on, do we think that this is appropriate? Do we think we should look at other types of concrete? And right now there's a lot of brick paving that's used as sort of an accent paving or a secondary paving, and is this still appropriate? And then you can see the bike rack and trash receptacle benches and tree grates have all been adapted with sort of Del Mar logos and Del Mar specific, plaques and things on that. So it's seeming appropriate to us that we keep utilizing and using these site furnishings, but we would like feedback on, if somebody has a problem with us moving forward with any of these. And just talking, there are some questions on your handout about the exposed aggregate concrete and whether this is appropriate and should be able to move forward with it. And then thinking a little bit more about the secondary or accent paving. We're thinking that you would want to use that primary paving or some sort of primary paving, but then at special areas such as cafe seating areas or in the bulb outs or other potential areas, you might want to look at other materials that sort of help separate it. Is the red brick material appropriate? Do we want to look at a different style of concrete, or earth tone pavers, or flagstone paving, or even precast concrete pavers? One thing that we were talking a lot about at City Hall, and these are a lot of materials we're using at City Hall, are the idea that the earth tones maybe are really much more about Del Mar and the sort of sandstone cliffs, but people still are drawn to the red brick pavers, and this could be one way to kind of help create those zones that we were talking about earlier, that certain areas might have different accent paving. Just as an example, but we've got a series of questions on that as well too. The next kind of median and pedestrian roadway improvements I want to talk about, these are more of the pedestrian safety or sort of other items in the have-to-do list. And again, wanting to include as many of these in the short-term improvements or this phase 1 improvements as we can. The first of these is looking at adding a diagonal scramble crosswalk at 15th Street. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this term, but basically a scramble crosswalk allows a dedicated crossing for pedestrians where all vehicular traffic stops in all 4 directions. The light comes on and people are allowed to cross in any direction, laterally and diagonally. And thinking this might help alleviate some pedestrian movements during the really busier months. I'm just wanting to know what people's thoughts are on if this is appropriate or not. We would still keep the dedicated movement with traffic in the other directions while the lights were green, so that pedestrians could still move east or west or north or south during those regular light cycles. Another item that we would like to get a little bit of feedback is the idea of adding median refuge areas. And you can see the photo on the right shows what we're kind of talking about here, that you'd have a little area where pedestrians could sort of land at the median, and it would cut basically the width of Camino Del Mar in half, but right now as you're seeing cars at the stop sign, that they could wait for cars to go through. But knowing also that the existing medians in a lot of these areas are only roughly 2 feet wide, it kind of poses the next question, or the bigger question of, are there areas where we would actually want to look at eliminating the left turn pockets in order to create a wider median and creating a wider sort of pedestrian refuge island? And in this instance, we're not talking about actually getting rid of the left turns, but we're just saying that we would get rid of the little pockets where basically 2 to 3 cars back up in these locations. But we would still allow left turns to actually occur from that existing travel lane, so you could make the U-turn or make the left turn, but just from the existing travel lane. We'd like feedback on whether or not we think that that's appropriate, and some other things that just to sort of mention that these really only occurred at 11th and 13th Street, and that the northbound ones on 11th actually connect to the neighborhoods and maybe are a little more used. We're actually getting traffic count numbers now just to see how many people are using these turn lanes. But the ones on 13th Street in the southbound direction and 11th Street in the southbound direction may actually be a better candidates for closing. Is if you turn left in those blocks, you actually turn onto sort of dead-end roads. They're not really a through connection. The one at 13th Street is the library, and it roughly goes a block before you have to either go north or south. And just thinking, what do people think about that? Do you think we should look at getting rid of southbound ones only, look at getting rid of all of them? Do you think it's a bad idea? Any feedback you have on this would be welcome, but really trying to create areas for, additional landscaping and safer crossings. Another thing that we're looking at is adding a mid-block crossing at 10th Street. The photo on the left shows an existing mid-block crossing at 12th Street that was added within the last couple of years. And there's a little push button here and lights that show up on the ground that actually highlight, to drivers if somebody's trying to cross. There's the new striping, and then there is a curb cut here in this area that allows sort of safe crossing. And thinking that we'd like to add this at 10th Street as well too. It's a little hard to see on the small screen, but people are actually using this as a cut through now. The landscaping is trampled in this median, and this is the block that will actually connect to future Town Hall and City Hall. And thinking we'd like to do something similar here at 12th that we're doing at 10th. But we've also heard some feedback that, traffic is really moving at a pretty fast rate through here, and wondering, should we look at some other types of vehicular warnings, such as rumble strips, or even sort of the idea of a raised crosswalk to make it a little bit more visible for cars and to help slow them down in this location. Another intersection item that we'd like to include is the idea or the thought of adding a 4th crosswalk at all the stop signs. Currently, if you're a pedestrian, you come up to a stop sign now and trying to cross east-west across Camino Del Mar, only one side of the actual street has this crosswalk striping. And thinking we'd like to add that to both sides just to be a little bit more pedestrian friendly, as we're showing in the photo on the right. So that one seems like a very easy and simple solution, but just trying to get feedback on whether people think that's good or bad. Another item that we've been talking about, it's a little bit more special and unique, is the idea of parklets. And I'm sure people have probably heard the term parklet, but it's basically the idea of doing some sort of temporary improvement, usually by taking away a parking space that could be added back later, but it allows for somebody that might have a cafe or some sort of use to build outdoor seating, or even the idea of sort of game tables or exercise or fitness equipment. There's a whole ton of things that people are using parklets for. And the reason that you're seeing the gray background on this is we're thinking that this might be a longer term solution, because it would require some sort of code or policy and some sort of agreement that would basically allow a property owner or business owner to actually take away one of their parking spaces for a public benefit to build a parklet. And the good thing about the parklets is they're not permanent construction. So if you wanted to move these away later, or relocate it somewhere down the line, you literally can just sort of pick these up and move them somewhere else, or disassemble them. They're not permanent installations with curbs. So, we would like to know if people think these are a good idea, and if we should be looking at some sort of parklet policy as we move forward. Also thinking a little bit about the climate action plan and alternative vehicles. We're trying to gauge interest or feedback on, should we look at locations for scooter or motorcycle vehicle parking, thinking about some of the leftover areas that aren't necessarily big enough to get a full car in, but I think it might also help alleviate, motorcycles or scooters from actually taking car spaces, so that there might be more readily available car parking in some locations. And then also thinking you could do this for micro vehicles as well too, like smart cars or other things that, if there's a space that isn't big enough for a car, should we actually stripe and try to dedicate some areas for motorcycles or these smart cars? Also thinking about bike parking, is there a need or a want or a desire to include more bike parking within the streetscape? Right now it's very, very limited. Not thinking that this has to be in the street as shown here, but it could happen on the sidewalk, or in other locations. But one thing that we have also talked about too, and we'd like to gauge feedback, is what do people think about looking into exploring bike rental sharing programs similar to what a lot of other cities have. And these could actually occur on wider sidewalks, or they could actually occur by taking a parking space, and thinking that actually might alleviate some of the traffic or vehicular trips if we're getting people on bicycles that can bike up and down the corridor. Another thing that we're talking about in terms of phase one, just being a little more forward thinking on the climate action plan too, is thinking about EV charging readiness, and thinking that we're not necessarily installing car chargers, but we'd like to lay conduit now if we are ripping up the sidewalks and adding a lot of these pieces that would basically just be conduit that would allow for easy connections without having to rip up the sidewalk in the future, knowing that, you know, that we may be headed this way in the direction that could sort of save us some headache. Do people think that that's a good idea along the streetscape? Kind of jumping into some of the, getting close to wrapping these up before we take some questions here, but one of the bigger ideas that we'd really like to talk about is the idea of the town and country parking, and we really think that this is a opportunity to make kind of a big, bold move with the streetscape and really make a big improvement for the pedestrian zones. And there may be an opportunity to sort of partner with businesses and look at this. But this is basically an example of something that's called town and country parking. And I'm not sure how familiar that term is to everybody here, but the town and country parking is essentially parking that occurs on private property and public property. And you can see the property line in this location is roughly where the red dashed line is here. And the town and country parking, I should just preface, varies from block to block. So this isn't a consistent condition throughout the whole entire corridor. Some areas, the cars are much further back and there are wider sidewalks, but this is kind of one good example of a really big opportunity. And this private parking that's here, or the parking that it's primarily occurring on this private property, actually counts toward the business owner's parking counts. But as what we're also noticing, and then a lot of locations, there's this sort of undefined zone that occurs behind the parking out to the bike lane. You can see the bike lane highlighted here in green. And thinking that potentially if we could relocate or push this parking back into this undefined zone, that it creates this larger or wider opportunity zone adjacent to the building to do a larger sidewalk, a cafe seating area, you know, opportunities for bike parking or you know, additional or wider planting if you wanted to have more of like a garden in the front or wider streetscape. That there's sort of a lot of opportunities here. And thinking, you know, that we'd want to push this back an appropriate level if that's you know, of interest, in thinking about what kind of policy we would have to do. That, you know, some people are counting these as private parking spaces, but we would, you know, look at grandfathering people in, that these parking spaces would still count toward your count, and, you know, not trying to put a burden or anything like that on the businesses. So there's some thinking and processing here in code that has to go through, or whatever agreements are currently in place, really with the thought of trying to create a safer walking area. You can see a person actually walking kind of behind the cars here and trying to move them closer to the business frontage. That way there is a little bit more visibility and they're not interfering with cars. And a good example of this, it's a little hard to see in this photo, is Cafe Secret. You can see the trees back behind here. And if I jump to the next photo, this is looking the opposite way, where Cafe Secret actually has already relocated their cars back behind this area. And they've created this sidewalk zone in this outdoor cafe seating area by doing this. So this just shows a rough example of what kind of things could actually be captured back for business or property owners in terms of having a space right next to their business instead of just having the cars right there, if it was worth looking at this as an opportunity. And with that, I'll just kind of jump into what our schedule and process has been and let you know kind of next steps, and then we'll open it up for questions or feedback and see if there's anything that people want us to address or if there are any questions. I don't think we've seen anything on the chat, so I'm hoping everybody is able to get on or add any questions on the chat. But looking at our meetings in June and May, we did some initial meetings with the Business Support Advisory Council and TPAC. DMVA didn't meet in May, but we've been talking to them sort of offline, and we'll continue conversations with them. We've also hosted a series of these business property owner meetings that you can see here, and this is kind of the final one, which is the webinar version. And then we also held a community outreach meeting as well too, that was held on June 14th for the community at large. We'll be going back then, now that this is the sort of last of our meetings, that the idea here being that we're going to take all this initial feedback. We're really just getting feedback and really listening to what people have to think about these elements and components. And then in July, we'll really start developing concept plan alternatives, and you'll start to see a lot of the bigger picture vision and a lot of where we're headed. And then we'll be doing more outreach in terms of another to the BSAC, DMVA, and TPAC organizations. Also be going back to an additional community outreach meeting and refining our plans over the next couple months, with the thought being that we would like to have a preferred plan in place to present to council by September of this year. And once council has an approved plan in place, we would jump into sort of construction documents for this first phase so that we could actually start construction for whatever phase 1 would be, and how we, what of these elements can we actually include as part of phase 1. And with that, concludes our presentation. We'd take any questions or anything that anybody has now, and we can jump back and forth on slides and view anything else that anybody has.
Great. So if you can utilize the chat feature and type in any questions that you have, you can send them to everyone, or you can click the toggle to send them just to City of Del Mar Rachel if you'd like to be anonymous with your question. I do see a question from Judy about feedback from Bike Walk Del Mar. We are asking for your feedback today. So so you missed the beginning where we talked about that we are not reducing the travel lanes. Fred, can you jump back to the slide that the very first handout, my kind of roadmap handout?
Yes.
Because I think a couple people might have missed that at the beginning. Okay, so this first handout, and I'm happy to email this to anybody if they'd like it, but basically, with regard to the street, we're not going to implement any roundabouts or take away any travel lanes. We are, and we're not planning any sharrows. We are planning to maintain a bike lane on both sides of the street, and that's the plan at this time. With regard to the feedback from Bike Walk Del Mar, we would love for you to fill out the survey, not really a survey, the handout that I sent out via email. You should be able to either type or you can print it out and handwrite your comments in there and send that back to me. And if you'd like, you could send that back to me as late as tomorrow. If you want to have some of your other Bike Walk Del Mar partners collaborate on that, that would be totally fine. What are we doing where there are no bike lanes? I think the plan there is to restripe, right, Fred? You can speak to that.
Yeah, the plan is to restripe. So basically, we are planning on taking the section from 9th to 13th and basically matching the section that has been done from 13th to 15th. So the travel lanes and the bike lanes will basically be a consistent width throughout the whole entire length of the corridor. And that involves basically taking some extra width from some of the wider areas that are kind of the undefined zone. There was kind of a foot or two taken out of some of the travel lanes. There's also really wide gutters that make it pretty unsafe for people to be biking. So as part of the stormwater improvements and upgrades, we'll be looking at really capturing some of that widened gutter lane that really exists. I think 11th is where that gutter actually is. So since the 13th to 15th section has become kind of the newer standard section, we'd like to carry that throughout the whole entire corridor and make that the consistent piece. So there's not the back and forth as if you're a bike, what you need to do.
Great, thanks. And I'm seeing your comments there. So make sure that if you that you can include that in the feedback packet that I sent out, and you can definitely incorporate your comments there. Everything from the webinar and from the submitted feedback will be taken into consideration, and I appreciate your feedback with regard to that. Are there any questions on any other topics or from anyone else? Are there any other questions? Judy, I do see your comments about the sharrows and the bike lanes. And I would just encourage you to provide any feedback on the handout that I sent out with regard to that. And with regarding no sharrows, that's something Fred, can you maybe speak to why we've kind of arrived at that consensus already?
Yes, we actually did an initial outreach in April to the council, and City Council felt that there were just a few items that would stop us or preclude us from basically moving the project forward when we did the check-in, and Sharrows were one of the items that they thought was too much kind of a third rail, as were sort of roundabouts. So that's why you're not seeing them included as a discussion item here. The thing I would just say is that anything that we do wouldn't preclude Sharrows from becoming a future item or improvement that could be done just with restriping or modifying that. So looking at having the bike lane area and the sort of travel lanes would still allow for Sharrows in the future, but wouldn't stop it in. And it's not something we want to look at because we feel that it would, if we are looking at trying to vet out the Sharrows versus the bike lanes as a part of this project, it would probably kill the ability to do anything in January. But thinking that since 13th to 15th has already gone in, we would just continue that through the rest of the corridor.
So Michael, more parking for shops, that's a great question. You want to go ahead and speak to that, Brad?
Yeah, definitely. So we definitely aren't looking at removing any parking, but we do have some opportunities or some potential to look at reorganizing or reconfiguring some of the odd conditions that are out there where there's kind of some funny curbs or funny areas. And I think that as we were looking at this, there might be the ability to, gain parking in a few locations. There might be some, we also would want to look at, not necessarily going to just parallel parking everywhere, but sort of keeping the diagonal parking as well too. But one thing that's actually come up, and I think this would be interesting for people's feedback too, is, would people be interested in even like back-end diagonal parking? Even thinking about the bike safety or whatever as well too. Sort of another question. But then the other thing in terms of more parking for shops, the City Hall Town Hall project actually is adding about 140 parking spaces, 50 of which throughout the daytime will be dedicated towards staff, but those will be open public parking spaces. So there will be some additional parking along the corridor as well too. But as we do look at the streetscape, we will be looking at opportunities to add parking or clean up items that are a little bit better, but wholesale, there's not a lot of room to add, 50 or 60 spaces throughout the corridor, say, but we might be able to find 10 or 12 here or there.
And then a question about how will the plan impact the Hillstone project bullies?
Yeah, so right now we haven't really done any outreach for any of the current projects that are underway, but it's something that we would definitely want to meet and sit down and talk to anybody that does have these projects in process or in works, to see if there's what kind of partnerships or what sort of thing we could actually do to make sure that, as we're making these improvements, there's, something that we could do that works for everybody. But I think the idea, if I remember correctly, for bullies, there was going to be outdoor cafe seating, but I'm not quite sure on that. I might be misspeaking, and I don't want to throw that out there or start any rumors,
right.
But that's something that we would want to definitely collaborate with, whoever would be doing that, to make sure that we're making use of, what the city can provide as part of the streetscape project that, doesn't impede or impinge on what Bullies is planning. And, maybe there's even some sort of mutual benefit or partnership that, as we're looking at this, that, really could be beneficial to both parties.
Great. Any other questions? So we've recorded the presentation, and we should have that available shortly. And if you are able to visit the city's website under the Stay Informed tab, you have the opportunity to subscribe to updates regarding this project. So any future meetings or updates will be sent out to our notification list. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to email me directly. My email, most of you received my email with the instructions for the webinar today, but it's rbeld with a D at the end at delmar.ca.us, rbeld at delmar.ca.us. And so with that, I don't know, do we have anything else to add, Brad?
I don't think so. If anybody's got any other sort of feedback or questions, definitely do email. And even if you want to fill out the forms that were passed out yesterday, or the questionnaires, do send those back, or feel free to pass along to others to have them fill out and send back as well too. If you know others that couldn't make the presentation, we definitely are trying to reach out to as many people as we can to get as much feedback as possible. So
great. And then one last thing I did want to mention is that this was our first community outreach via webinar. So if you have any comments or suggestions, I'd love to see an email directly to me regarding the format and if it worked for you. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.